This session is on the politics and governance of basic education. My name is Brian Levy. I teach at the School of International Studies at Johns Hopkins University and the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance at the University of Cape Town. The point of departure for this talk is the 2018 World Development Report's concentric circles framework for explaining what are the determinants of learning outcomes. And I'm not going to go into this framework in detail. I will assume that those of you watching this are familiar with it. I simply want to note that what makes it especially powerful is its distinction between the proximate determinants of learning, quality of teachers, quality of school management, inputs available at school, the preparedness of learners, and what I would call the exogenous determinants of learning, which are flagged here in terms of all the stakeholders that shape the performance of an education system. And what we are going to do in this talk at the broadest level is we are going in this talk to explore how, if you like, that middle circle, the proximate determinants of learning, and the outer circles interact. And we are going to do it with a focus particularly on improving learning outcomes in public school systems. Now, one of the things that I think makes this framework so especially powerful is it underscores the interdependence of the various parts of that learning system. It shows how the actions of any one actor and their effectiveness depends in critical ways on whether or not those actions are aligned with the actions and the incentives of the other stakeholders. This is a complex system. And it's in the nature of a complex system that it can be difficult to change, that a system can be stuck in low-level traps if one actor tries to affect change, but the system as a whole is geared in a different direction. That change can't happen. And so where this leads is it leads thinking about education systems, and this is all in that 2018 World Development Report on Learning, it leads to ask two sets of questions about the system. Is the system coherent? Are the various actors in that system pulling in a similar direction? And insofar as it is coherent, is it aligned to learning? And as you see in this particular slide, where the answer that we all want is yes, it is coherent, and yes, it is aligned to learning, which is the green cell in this framework. But there are also two other sets of possibilities. There's the possibility that the system is fragmented, and there's the possibility that it is coherent, but it's not coherent around learning. It's coherent around something else, process compliance or patronage. Now, if you just look at it like this, there's a certain sense of this that a system is either one thing or another. And so a minor tweak that I have found helpful, this slide was, a minor tweak that I have found helpful is to simply open this up by pointing out that these aren't just yes or no questions, but that these are more or less questions. And so we have different degrees to which a system is coherent or is aligned to learning. And in particular, as you will see as this presentation unfolds, what is particularly of interest to us are the spaces, the mustard cell on the bottom left. Where, what do you do in a setting in which a system is neither coherent nor aligned to learning? And what do you do if a system is coherent, but it's not aligned to learning? These are difficult challenges. And especially for those of you that are specialists in education, as you're going to see, this is going to take us into a politics direction, and it's going to take us in towards perhaps some unfamiliar spaces. So I need to make a key qualifying point up front. This is not an argument that the kinds of skills that education sector specialists have aren't useful. If you look at that arrow in the top right of the diagram, if a system is in what I call the bureaucratic sweet spot, then all the kinds of things that are the technical specialties of people that work in education, teacher support mechanisms, scripted learning, all of those are doable and they can improve learning outcomes. I also want to underscore that if a system is trapped in the bottom left of this, the bureaucracy is dysfunctional. And insofar as it is possible to improve the functioning of the bureaucracy, better deployment of resources, of teachers, of textbooks, of buildings, all of that also adds value. So I want to underscore this because I feel it important not to be misunderstood in relation to this. But having said that, here is the problem that we are going to be exploring. What do you do if a system is stuck? If the politics, symbolized, if you like, by the black lines on this diagram, if the politics imply that, yeah, it's not coherent, it's not aligned to learning, and you can't simply make it more coherent by wishing it so. Similarly, it is coherent, but it's coherent towards something other than learning, and you can't simply make it more aligned to learning by wishing it so. How do you address that problem? And that's essentially a question about politics and context. How does context shape the performance of a system? And how, given different contexts, might one intervene in order to achieve better outcomes? Not perfect outcomes, but better outcomes. And so the way this, it's actually a pair of sessions, will come together is as follows. We've already talked through the World Development Report framework. We now are going to talk through conceptually the issues around and how to think about political context and how political context might affect learning outcomes. And then in the second part of this, we are going to apply this framework. We're going to apply it to a case, the case of South Africa, variations across two provinces, and also comparison between some of those South African cases and Kenya. And then we are going to draw out some lessons in terms of what is to be done to improve learning outcomes. So let me move now towards the discussion of how do you analyze political context. And to understand context, there's a huge amount of work that's done, and the view is often said, well, every country is unique. But actually, one of the things that I believe we've learned in over the last 10, 15, 20 years is you can think systematically about context. You can think about different classes of context. And in thinking about different contexts, you can actually turn to 4 variables, which are the key to understanding context. The first 2 are institutions and power, and governance in some sense an umbrella around those. And I'm going to say more about those 2 systematically in a moment. But then also, as you will see as this talk unfolds, there's the role of ideas and how ideas have an independent role in shaping what's doable. And there's the extent of inclusion. Is a society narrowly exclusionary, or is it broadly inclusive? And so these will be the 4 variables that, in trying to understand context and apply it to ask the question, what can be done, that we will be using. So let me say some more about the first 2 of these, institutions and power. So institutions is a classic definition of institutions. Institutions are the rules of the game. So if you think about a sports game, you have the players of the game and you have the rules of the game. In order for the game to function, you need to have rules. They need to be monitored and enforced. And as that sub-definition you see there sometimes describes it, the rules can be thought of as the humanly devised constraints which govern human interactions. It's the rules of the game that make a game of football, for example, playable. Otherwise, it just wouldn't work as the game. So that's one dimension of rules of the game. It's a definition. But notice that the rules of the game, this is an important feature of them, and you'll see, they can be impersonal. The rules apply equally to all who have standing. And if you like, at the limit, at the most aggregate level, that means that you're operating in a political economy, a governance system in which the rule of law applies and applies equally to all, or the rules of the game can be personalized. A small group of us agree to try to cooperate to do something together, and we have a deal. Deals versus rules, if you like. Personalized versus impersonal institutions. So that's a comment, and it's one dimension of institutions. The second dimension, which is also a dimension of power, is what are the relationships between the actors? Is it a hierarchical relationship? Is it a relationship between a principal and an agent, an employer and an employee, a senior official in a bureaucracy and a junior official? Or is it a relationship between multiple stakeholders, multiple principals, if you like, all of whom have equal standing and who need to negotiate with one another, formally or tacitly, informally, in order to achieve an outcome? And so these are the two dimensions that we are going to use to think, coming later to either role of ideas and inclusion, to think about different contexts. And taking these two produces this framework. This is a somewhat simplified version of a framework that I spell out in detail in the 2014 book, Working with the Grain, Integrating Governance and Growth in Development Strategies. But what you see when you simply look at this framework now, and you take these two dimensions that we have talked through, you can see it gives us four so-called ideal types, four types that have very distinctive characteristics that distinguish them from others and provide a way for thinking about different contexts. So one type is this set of types whether you have hierarchical relationships, it's principal agent and it's dominant, but think of also especially dominant and discretionary, where power is concentrated at the center. That power is not constrained. That's the top left cell. And then you also have the bottom row, where you have multi-stakeholder circumstances, multiple principles, and these multiple principles can be in a personalized or an impersonal relationship. One of the features of this framework is that actually you can use it to think about the logic of governance at a variety of different levels. At the broadest level, you can think of it as a way of characterizing different political settlements, and with these four types. But at the level of an individual organization, you can ask, how does the organization function? Is this organization essentially hierarchical? Is it an organization with a huge amount of cooperation and collaboration amongst peers? How rule-bound is it? How flexible is it? So this framework, this way of thinking about context is useful at multiple levels. And what I'm going to do now, though, is I'm going to take a first example, which is taking the dominant and discretionary cell, and I'm going to think about that from the perspective of education at the broadest possible level, and use this to illustrate the extraordinary role in dominant and discretionary settings that the dominant ideas, the reigning ideas, if you like, of the political leadership have in shaping what happens in terms of learning outcomes in a system. And I have 4 country examples that we look at, all of which are dominant examples. And what is striking about these 4 examples is what drives the education system. You know, those of us who come to working on education and education systems because of a commitment to learning, we presuppose that the goal of an education system is to improve learning. Literacy, numeracy, critical thinking, etc. But actually, you look across different settings and you realize that there are radically different goals. So let's take the example then of Indonesia under President Suharto. So the goal of the education system under President Suharto was not principally literacy, numeracy, critical thinking. It was principally creating a sense of shared national identity, a sense of shared citizenship, the Indonesian ideology in this diverse society known as Pancasila. So when you assess what is achieved in Indonesia's education system, to focus just on learning outcomes is not to focus on what was central to this dominant discretionary setting under General Suharto. Vietnam, by contrast, and Vietnam is an extreme positive outlier in its learning outcomes, a learning-oriented approach to a universal learning-oriented approach to education was much stronger. It was somewhat rote learning. It was somewhat less critical thinking. It was shaped broadly by the ideology and the vision of the Vietnamese Communist Party. Take a third example, which is the example of Rwanda when Paul Kabila becomes president. One of the remarkable things that General Kabila wanted to do is he wanted to shift the national language of Rwanda from French to English. Now, if you're going to shift the national language, it means you have all kinds of challenges of your teachers, you have challenges of your curriculum, but he was determined to do it. So you don't see learning outcomes conventionally measured because the goal was to shift the national language. Or take the example of Nigeria in the early years of its military dictatorship. To a significant degree, the goal of the Nigerian system was to try to bring a certain standardization, redress in relation to massive regional inequalities, and to do that via universal access, in which the relatively strong parts of the system, largely in the south of the country, actually paid an enormous price for massive expansions of access with limited resources. But the goal wasn't learning outcomes, the goal was access. And over time, that goal descends over decades into goals of patronage and predation. So what you see here is, notice the features of this. You see a setting where dominance means that what happens in the system is shaped by political leadership at the top. And what drives political leadership at the top, to summarize, are distinctive ideas which produce the outcomes. And so when we want to think both how you assess these systems and what the possibilities of change are for these systems, we have to take this logic and this role of ideas seriously. Now, that's actually all I'm going to say in today's session about the dominant systems, because the remainder of the second part of this presentation is going to focus much, much more on systems where you have multi-stakeholders, multiple principles. And I just want to make 2 points on this, and then I will end this first part of the presentation. The first point that I want to make is the cell that is called personalized and competitive. So one way at the broadest level to think about this cell is, back in the 1990s, we had what was known as the third wave of democratization. Large numbers of countries around the world went from being authoritarian to democratic. But in practice, what that meant was that, yes, there was a shift from the top row to the bottom row, from a hierarchical to a more democratic or multi-stakeholder system, but it was not a sudden emergence of impersonal rules of the game. What was basically, you had in many, many of these newly democratizing settings, you had the following characteristics. They were characterized by only small disparities of power between the contending factions. Beyond the agreement to say, let's figure out who's going to govern by having an election, there were few formal rules in place. Indeed, the basis for stability in these settings was often the discretionary conferral and withdrawal of favor, which includes posts, which includes procurement contracts, which includes influence in a variety of ways, and the time horizons are short. There's a very troubling implication that follows from this, which is many of the so-called best practices education sector policies presuppose long time horizons, high-performing bureaucracies, and a coherence which is absent. They won't work. What might be the entry points for improvement? We will come to that in the second part of this talk, but let me, by way of summarizing this part, just simply put up this slide. So what we saw is, we began with the 2018 World Development Report, and we saw that there were three distinct patterns that were striking for us. Was the system coherent? If so, what is it aligned around, or was it fragmented? What we also did is we then stepped back and we said, let's think about different political contexts. And here I've highlighted the three that we've spent some time on. And what I want you to notice here is, notice the bottom row. In the bottom row, the context we just talked through, that personalized competitive system. That personalized competitive system is completely consistent. Indeed, it's the backdrop of the politics to the fragmented education system that we saw in the World Development Report. And as we will explore in the second part of this talk, that kind of personalized and competitive system tends to produce inevitably a bureaucracy that is fragmented. So we have to come to grips with, having walked through the political economy, the nature of bureaucratic fragmentation, its roots in politics, and what can be done. Then the top two rows of this are systems that are coherent, And the interesting thing about these coherent systems is you can get a coherent system, as we saw, through the dominant and discretionary political context. You can also get a coherent system through an impersonal and competitive system. However, it's rather uncertain. And we saw this for the dominance, and we'll spend time in the second part of this on the impersonal and competitive. It's rather uncertain as to what that coherence is organized around, and what are the range of possible goals and outcomes. And so this is where I will end the first part of this talk, the framework, linking it through conceptually into politics. And then in the second part of this talk, we will apply this framework to the examples.